What's gaming, gamers? Today, I'll be describing a build which uses the newly buffed Class Exotic Glaive for Hunters, Edge of Concurrence, as well as the Hunter Exotic Arms Armor Triton Vice. This build is designed entirely around Triton Vice and its buffs to Glaives, as well as making the most out of the Edge of Concurrence Glaive and the Arc subclass. I'll detail what the Glaive does and the buffs it received this season later in the video during the weapons section, but for now, I'll explain what Triton Vice does in case you're not aware. Triton Vice will grant any glaive you wield an additional 50 reload speed and a 100% damage boost to the glaive's melee attack while surrounded by 3 or more enemies. Furthermore, glaive melee final blows overflow around into the glaive's magazine from reserves, effectively removing your need to reload so long as you're getting melee kills. Lastly, if the glaive you wield's element matches the subclass you have equipped, enemies you kill will explode upon being killed with the projectile, dealing damage in an area around them. Before I get into the rest of the video, I'd first like to shout out our clan, the Tyrant Seraphs. If you're looking for people to play any content in Destiny with, ranging from ritual playlist and seasonal activities all the way to raids and Grandmaster strikes, feel free to join the Discord server. We welcome anyone, no matter how new or seasoned you are, and all of us will teach encounters if you don't know something. If you're interested, hop into the Discord server and play some Destiny with us. The link is in the description. Additionally, if you'd like to watch me play games more often, come hang out with me on Twitch. I usually play Destiny or Overwatch over there, so if that interests you, the link for that is also in the description. To start with the build itself, I'll detail the subclass setup. I'll put everything on screen first as a prescriptive setup if that's what you prefer, and once I've done that, I'll go over everything in detail, describing what each subclass element does and why I've chosen it. Run the Gathering Storm Super, the Marksman's Dodge, whichever jump you prefer, the Disorienting Blow Melee, the Pulse Grenade, the Flow State Aspect, the Tempest Strike Aspect, Spark of Beacons, Spark of Discharge, Spark of Ions, and Spark of Shock. To describe the subclass, I'll start with the Super. Gathering Storm is chosen as it's a set and forget super, allowing you to use the build itself more often. Additionally, while the Arcstaff Super can deal significant damage to bosses and clear adds incredibly effectively, set effectiveness is most noticeable when Arcstaff is buffed by an exotic armor piece like Raiden Flux. As this build doesn't make use of an exotic that buffs the Arcstaff, Gathering Storm is more often than not the better option. That's not to say you can't use the Arcstaff, however. If you prefer it, it's still a decent option. For the dodge, the Marksman's Dodge is chosen simply because, when wielding a glaive, you can't use your melee ability whatsoever. As such, Marksman's Dodge will be more useful more often. This build does have a plethora of reload speed enhancing buffs, however, so if you'd prefer using the Gambler's Dodge to refund your melee ability on command, that is an option available to you. Onto the melee, I choose to run the Disorienting Blow melee as it's a free source of the blind effect on command so long as my glaive is stowed. If there's a problematic enemy you need to CC for a short time, Disorienting Blow does just that. Combination Blow isn't as useful with this build as it's a build designed around utilizing the glaive, and in order to get the most out of Combination Blow, you have to stow the glaive, defeating the purpose of the build. For the grenade, the Pulse Grenade is the grenade I like the most for dealing damage to enemies. However, the Flashbang Grenade can also be good as a source of both damage and the blind effect if you find the Disorienting Blow melee to be too risky. But I personally find the Flashbang Grenade to be a bit finicky to throw accurately enough to have it actually blind the target I want without it bouncing away, so I prefer to forego the blind effect altogether from the grenade and use the Pulse Grenade purely for its damage. Onto the aspects, firstly, Flow State. Flow State will grant you the Amplified status instantly upon defeating any jolted target, which will be happening often as the Edge of Concurrence Glaive will be jolting targets frequently. Furthermore, while Amplified, Flow State grants you a 200% increase to your class ability's passive regeneration rate, 50 points to your weapon's reload speed stat, and a 66% damage resistance while in your dodge animation. Flow State is simply the best aspect to have equipped for this build, as becoming Amplified is important to this build's effectiveness and the buffs granted while Amplified are helpful. The second aspect, Tempest Strike, will simply grant you another way to jolt targets, and by extension, another way of becoming Amplified. So long as your melee ability is fully charged and your glaive is stowed, casting your powered melee ability while sliding will cause a wave of arc energy to surge forward, dealing damage and jolting any enemies damaged by the wave. Defeating these jolted targets will then amplify you due to the Flow State aspect, making this a useful way of becoming Amplified if your Edge of Concurrence is out of ammo. For the fragments, firstly, Spark of Beacons. Spark of Beacons will cause any enemy killed with an arc special weapon while amplified to explode, applying the blind debuff to nearby enemies. Unfortunately, this only applies to Edge of Concurrence's projectile shot and not its melee attack, but it's still useful as a passive crowd controlling utility to make groups of enemies less of a threat to you. Next, Spark of Discharge will cause any arc weapon kill to progress a hidden counter that, upon reaching 100%, will summon an Ionic Trace. As with Spark of Beacons, this only applies to Edge of Concurrence's projectile shot, making it less useful for this build than builds that take advantage of primary ammo arc weapons, but it's still a free Ionic Trace every 2 to 3 kills. Spark of Discharge does decrease your strength stat by 10 points, but the melee ability isn't used all too often anyways, and as such, the stat deduction is negligible. The third fragment is Spark of Ions. Spark of Ions will cause the defeat of any jolted target to summon an Ionic Trace. Unfortunately, this Ionic Trace has a 10-second cooldown, meaning you can only summon one Ionic Trace via Spark of Ions every 10 seconds. This is a significant amount of time between Ionic Traces, but with how often this build will be jolting targets using the Grenade ability, Edge of Concurrence, and the Tempest Strike aspect, you'll effectively have a free Ionic Trace every 10 seconds. Lastly, for fragments is Spark of Shock. Spark of Shock will cause your arc grenades to apply jolt to any target damaged by the grenade, which will be helpful for this build in every way I've already described. Spark of Shock will lower your discipline stat by 10 points, but that's a small price to pay for the significant increase in utility granted to your grenade ability. As for alternative fragments, there are a couple you could use instead of the ones I've mentioned. Firstly, if you're running the Pulse Grenade, Spark of Magnitude can be useful for increasing its total damage capabilities. Spark of Magnitude also buffs the Lightning and Storm grenades, so if you decide to run either of those grenades, Spark of Magnitude is also an option. Next, for alternative fragments, Spark of Resistance will help with survivability when within close proximity of 3 or more enemies. When surrounded by enemies, Spark of Resistance will grant you a 25% damage resistance to all incoming damage, helping survivability a noticeable amount. In addition to the glaive buffs granted by Triton Vice while surrounded, you'll be significantly more survivable when within close proximity of 3 or more enemies. If you are to use either of the 2 alternative fragments I've just mentioned, I'd recommend removing Spark of Ions and Spark of Discharge in that order. Those 2 fragments are the most replaceable, and as such can be unequipped in favor of either of the 2 alternative fragments I've mentioned. With the subclass fully detailed, I'll get into a few seasonal artifact mods I recommend in case you're watching this video during Season 23, the Season of the Wish. Before I get into that, however, full disclosure, I am writing this script before Season of the Wish releases, and I only have the artifact mod previews from the TWID released during the final week of the Season of the Witch. Thus, I won't have any specific numbers for the artifact mods, so my apologies for that. In any case, there aren't any mods this season that specifically synergize with this build, whether that be the Arc subclass or Glaives as weapons. As such, only a few specific artifact mods are worth bringing in all cases, and any other artifact mods will be build dependent on what other weapons you decide to bring along. Firstly, Wished into Being will cause your ability final blows to summon orbs of power when your super is nearly fully charged. Wearing Season of the Wish armor apparently decreases the threshold of what consists as nearly fully charged, but I'm not sure how significant of a decrease this will be. In any case, you'll be getting kills with grenades somewhat frequently, and if you use Tempest Strike's melee ability as well, it will summon orbs of power for you so long as your super is nearly fully charged. Lastly, if you're playing by yourself, the Solo Operative mod will increase the amount of damage you deal to enemies. This only works if you're the only member of your fire team, so it's not worth equipping this artifact mod if you're running activities with other people or are running matchmade activities. Any other artifact mods you want to equip will simply depend on what weapons you decide to run in your kinetic and heavy slots, but I'll talk more about what I recommend towards the end of the video. With the artifact now detailed, I'll get into the armor setup I recommend for use with this build. I'll detail armor stat distribution first, and after that I'll go over the mod setup. For armor stat distribution, in the top 3 stat grouping of Mobility, Resilience, and Recovery, spec into Resilience 4 mostly, with Recovery 2nd and Mobility 3rd. Resilience will be the most important stat in the top 3 stat grouping as it directly dictates both the amount of health you have as well as your base overall damage resistance. Every tier of Resilience grants you an additive 3% damage resistance up to a maximum of 30% resistance at tier 10 Resilience. Recovery is an important stat as well. Recovery determines the rate at which you regenerate your health and shields, as well as lowering the delay between having received damage and the start of your health and shield regeneration. This makes Recovery a similarly important stat for survivability as Resilience. It is slightly less important, however, as a higher overall damage resistance is more beneficial in more scenarios than quicker health regeneration, so prioritize Resilience first. Mobility will be the least important stat in the top 3 stat grouping, but it isn't one to ignore altogether. Mobility governs your base movement speed and jump height, as well as being the hunter's class stat. This means mobility is directly tied to your dodge's recharge rate. Marksman's dodge already has an incredibly short cooldown, and as such, mobility isn't terribly important for this build, but having a few tiers of mobility will help with your dodge's uptime a noticeable amount. For the bottom 3 stat grouping of Discipline, Intellect, and Strength, spec into Discipline first, with Intellect and Strength both being secondary stats. Discipline will be the most useful stat for the bottom 3 stat grouping as it dictates your grenade's base cooldown. The higher your discipline stat, the faster your grenade will passively recharge. As the grenade is thrown often with this build to proc the jolt effect, having a higher discipline stat is beneficial for the build's effectiveness. Intellect is an incredibly in-depth stat that I simply will not go into significant detail about in this video. Suffice it to say that Intellect is correlated to both your super's base cooldown and the rate at which you generate your super actively. As this build doesn't utilize the super for anything significant besides a burst of damage, Intellect isn't important and can be ignored for the most part. Lastly, for stats, Strength will determine your melee ability's base cooldown. As the melee ability can't be used while your Edge of Concurrence Glaive is equipped, you'll pretty much only be using the melee ability while you're out of ammo. As such, you won't need your melee ability up all too often, which allows you to almost entirely ignore the strength stat. My armor stats have me at 51 mobility, 92 resilience, 70 recovery, 71 discipline, 32 intellect, and 40 strength. With the armor's stat distribution now detailed, I'll get into the armor's mod setup I recommend for use with this build. I'll put everything on screen first as a prescriptive setup, and once I've done that, I'll describe everything in more detail, explaining what each mod does and why I've chosen it. I'll then go over any alternative mod options should there be any. On your helmet, run 2 harmonic siphon mods and 1 siphon mod that corresponds with the damage type of the weapon in your kinetic slot. On your arms, run 1 bolstering detonation mod, 1 firepower mod, and 1 focusing strike mod. On your chest piece, run 2 of whatever resistance mods that you need for the content you'll be running, and 1 harmonic reserves mod. On your legs, run 1 arc weapon surge mod, 1 innervation mod, and 1 recuperation mod. Lastly, on your cloak, run 1 bomber mod, 1 powerful attraction mod, and 1 reaper mod. To detail the mods, firstly, the mods on the helmet. The 2 harmonic siphon mods will work together to summon a potent orb of power upon getting multi-kills with any arc weapon. This includes your Edge of Concurrence Glaive, but it only includes its charged shot, not its melee attack. Next, running a siphon mod that corresponds with the damage type of your kinetic weapon is important, as you'll almost always be using that when your glaive is out of ammo. Having a siphon mod for that weapon allows you to generate orbs of power when your glaive is out of ammo. Generating and collecting orbs of power is beneficial for this build, as it will grant you stacks of armor charge, instant health, and super energy. It's up to you whether to run 2 siphon mods for your kinetic weapon or for your glaive, but I find the glaive to have enough ammo that running 2 siphon mods for it is worthwhile. Onto the mods on the arms, firstly, the bolstering detonation mod. Running 1 bolstering detonation mod will grant you 12% class ability energy upon dealing damage with your grenade, which is simply a small bump to your class ability's uptime. It's not imperative to the build's effectiveness, but it will help your marksman's dodge to be off cooldown more often. Next, the firepower mod will cause an orb of power to be summoned upon the killing of an enemy with your grenade. Firepower now has an intrinsic 10-second cooldown between orb generations, but this build won't have grenades up more often than once every 10 seconds anyways, so that nerf doesn't affect this build whatsoever. Firepower simply acts as an extra orb when you get a kill with your grenade, which should happen almost every time you use the grenade. Lastly, running 1 focusing strike mod will grant you 12% class ability energy upon dealing damage with your powered melee attack. Similarly to bolstering detonation, this mod isn't entirely imperative to this build's effectiveness and simply serves as an increase to your marksman's dodge's uptime. For the chest pieces mods, simply running the resistance mods that you need for the content you'll be running should suffice. I also run a harmonic reserves mod alongside the resistance mods to increase the total amount of ammo I can hold for my Edge of Concurrence, but in my testing this isn't entirely necessary, so if you prefer running 3 resistance mods, that works just as well. Onto the legs mods, firstly, the innervation mod will grant you 10% grenade ability energy upon the collection of any orb of power with no cooldown. This will noticeably increase your grenade's uptime, allowing you to jolt targets more often when you're either out of ammo for your Edge of Concurrence or don't have a charged shot with the glaive. Grenade final blows will also summon an orb of power via the firepower mod, thus allowing your grenades to effectively only cost 90% energy to throw so long as you get a kill with them. Next, the recuperation mod will grant you 70 health upon the collection of any orb of power with no cooldown. This is a fantastic mod for survivability, and with the uptime of orbs of power, you'll be granted this health very often so long as you're generating orbs of power. Lastly, the Arc Weapon Surge mod will grant you a 10% damage boost to any arc weapons you have equipped while you have any stacks of armor charge. Although 10% may seem slight, this is a great bonus to your Edge of Concurrence's projectile shots damage, and will increase both the effectiveness of the normal projectile shot as well as the charged shot. If you'd like, you can forego the Innervation mod in favor of a second Arc Weapon Surge mod. This will increase the damage boost to your arc weapons while you have armor charge from 10% to 17%, which is itself a 70% increase to the effective damage boost. This is likely more useful overall than Innervation, but I find myself using the melee of the glaive more often than the projectile overall, so having the grenade up more often for its jolt allows me to use the glaive melee more often without losing out significantly on jolt uptime. Lastly, for armor mods, the cloaks mods. First, the bomber mod will refund you 12% of your grenade ability's energy upon the use of your class ability. This is very helpful for your grenade's uptime, and by extension your jolt uptime, which will increase the build's overall effectiveness. Next, the Powerful Attraction mod will cause the use of your class ability to collect any and all orbs of power within a radius of you. These orbs of power will grant you ability energy via Innervation, health via Recuperation, super energy, and stacks of armor charge for use with your Arc Weapon Surge mods. This isn't really an active use mod, and is more a passive bonus to collect orbs of power you didn't notice or didn't collect when they dropped, so long as those orbs are close enough to you when you use your class ability. Lastly, the Reaper mod will cause an orb of power to be summoned after having gotten a weapon kill within 10 seconds of having used your class ability. This is a recent change to the Reaper mod, but especially on Hunter, this isn't really a nerf, as you're generally using the dodge while in the midst of an engagement anyways. Reaper can also only summon an orb of power once every 10 seconds, but Marksman's dodge won't be off cooldown that often anyways, so that cooldown isn't anything to worry about. With the Armor's mod setup now completely detailed, I'll get into some weapons I recommend using with this build in the kinetic and heavy slots, and then I'll describe the Edge of Concurrence glaive in more detail. Firstly, for the kinetic slot, running any stasis or strand weapon is recommended, as this season's artifact is fantastic for synergizing with both stasis and strand weapons via the Unraveling Orbs and Dragonspite artifact mods. Any stasis or strand weapon you enjoy will work with this build. Damage perks like Frenzy or Collective Action are great options, along with ability regeneration perks like Demolitionist and Pugilist. Generally, your kinetic slot weapon will be a weapon you use as a secondary option to your Edge of Concurrence glaive, so having a weapon you can rely on when your glaive is out of ammo is important. As I said, any weapon you specifically enjoy using is good for this slot, so bring out whatever weapon you'd like. Onto the heavy slot, I prefer running a rocket launcher. This build is almost entirely dedicated to ad clearing, save for the Gathering Storm Super, so running a weapon that can deal significant and reliable boss damage is incredibly helpful. Furthermore, rocket launchers specifically synergize with this season's artifact via mods like Blast Radius and Argent Ordnance, so a rocket launcher is a fantastic option to run. As far as perks go, any perks you enjoy using for boss damage are good. Frenzy, Explosive Light, and even Bait and Switch if your glaive has ammo available to use. With the kinetic and heavy slots now detailed, I'll go over what specifically the Edge of Concurrence glaive does in case you're not aware. Edge of Concurrence has the perk Lightning Seeker, which allows you to ready a charged shot when the weapon's energy is full. The charged Lightning Seeker shot will deal significant damage to enemies, and if shot on the ground, will track to the nearest enemy and deal both damage and apply the jolt effect to the target. It also releases Chain Lightning when it strikes an enemy, allowing it to damage groups of enemies efficiently. Furthermore, as of Season 23, the exotic glaives have been buffed. I'll explain exactly what those buffs are now. When activating the glaive's perk, 1 ammo is granted to the weapon's magazine, allowing you to use the perk even if it's out of ammo so long as the glaive's energy is full. While the glaive's perk is active, its energy will no longer drain passively, removing the time limit to use the charged shot once it's active. Additionally, while the glaive's perk is active, both reloading and stowing the glaive no longer removes the active perk. These buffs make the exotic glaives so much more intuitive and forgiving to use, increasing their effectiveness immensely. With the entirety of the build now described, I can go over some tips and tricks for running this build yourself. Firstly, this build strives when within close proximity of enemies due to the abundance of effects procced when surrounded. Get up close and personal with your enemies and you'll see your effectiveness skyrocket. The Edge of Concurrence glaive is both the centerpiece of the build's offensive capabilities as well as a fantastic defensive utility. Don't be afraid to use its shield to be granted a significant 97.5% damage resistance to incoming damage. The glaive shield is incredibly strong if you find yourself out of position. Generate orbs of power whenever you can, and stay amplified as often as possible to make use of the speed boost buff to move between groups of enemies more swiftly. Amplified will also increase your mobility stat by 50 points, increasing the rate at which your class ability passively regenerates, allowing you to dodge more often. Collect orbs of power you've generated as often as possible, as the health granted by recuperation is also a significant source of this build's survivability. But that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Again, if you'd like to join our clan, the Tyrant Seraphs, the link to the Discord server is in the description. Furthermore, if you'd like to watch me stream some games sometime, come hang out with me over on Twitch. The link for that is also in the description. If you have any questions or constructive criticisms, please leave them in the comments. I read all of them and reply to all that I can. Thank you again for watching, and have a great day!